had a brilliant mind. He was honest, and everyone knew it. Emphatically independent by nature, hard-working, frugal, all traits in the New England tradition, he was anything but cold or laconic as supposedly New Englanders were. He could be high-spirited and affectionate, vain, cranky, impetuous, self-absorbed, and fiercely stubborn, passionate, quick to anger, and all-forgiving, generous and entertaining. He was blessed with great courage and with good humor, yet subject to spells of despair, and especially when separated from his family or during periods of prolonged inactivity. Ambitious to excel, to make himself known, he had nonetheless recognized at an early stage that happiness came not from fame and fortune and all such things, but from an habitual contempt of them, as he wrote. He prized the Roman ideal of honor, and in this, as in much else, he and Abigail were in perfect accord. Fame without honor, in her view, would be like a faint meteor gliding through the sky, shedding only transient light. As his family and friends knew, Adams was both a devout Christian and an independent thinker, and he saw no conflict in that. He was hard-headed and a man of sensibility, a close observer of human folly as displayed in everyday life, and fired by an inexhaustible love of books and scholarly reflection. He read Cicero, Tacitus, and others of his Roman heroes in Latin, and Plato and Thucydides in the original Greek, which he considered the supreme language. But in his need to fathom the labyrinth of human nature, as he said, he was drawn to Shakespeare and Swift, and likely to carry Cervantes or a volume of English poetry with him on his journeys. "You will never be alone with a poet in your pocket," he would tell his son Johnny. John Adams was not a man of the world. He enjoyed no social standing. He was an awkward dancer and poor at cards. He never learned to flatter. He owned no ships or glass factory, as did Colonel Josiah Quincy, Braintree's leading citizen. There was no money in his background, no Adams fortune or elegant Adams homestead like the Boston mansion of John Hancock. It was in the courtrooms of Massachusetts and on the printed page, principally in the newspapers of Boston, that Adams had distinguished himself. Years of riding the court circuit and his brilliance before the bar had brought him wide recognition and respect, and of greater consequence in recent years had been his spirited determination and eloquence in the cause of American rights and liberties. That he relished the sharp conflict and theater of the courtroom, that he loved the esteem that came with public life no less than he loved my farm, my family, and goose quill, there is no doubt, however frequently he protested to the contrary. His desire for distinction was too great. Patriotism burned in him like a blue flame. "I have a zeal at my heart for my country and her friends which I cannot smother or conceal," he told Abigail, warning that it could mean privation and unhappiness for his family unless regulated by cooler judgment than his own. In less than a year's time, as a delegate to the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, he had emerged as one of the most sensible and forcible figures in the whole patriot cause, the great and common cause, his influence exceeding even that of his better-known kinsman, the ardent Boston patriot Samuel Adams. He was a second cousin of Samuel Adams, but possessed of another species of character, as his Philadelphia friend Benjamin Rush would explain. He saw the whole of a subject at a glance, and was equally fearless of men and of the consequences of a bold assertion of his opinion. He was a stranger to dissimulation. It had been John Adams, in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, who rose in the Congress to speak of the urgent need to save the New England army facing the British at Boston, and in the same speech called on Congress to put the Virginian George Washington at the head of the army. That was now 6 months past. The general had since established a command at Cambridge, and it was there that Adams was headed. It was his third trip in a week to Cambridge, and the beginning of a much longer undertaking by horseback. He would ride on to Philadelphia, a journey of nearly 400 miles that he had made before, though never in such punishing weather or at so perilous an hour for his country. The man riding with him was Joseph Bass, a young shoemaker and Braintree neighbor hired temporarily as servant and traveling companion. The day was Wednesday, January 24th, 1776. The temperature, according to records kept by Adams' former professor of science at Harvard, John Winthrop, was in the low 20s. At the least, the trip would take 2 weeks, given the condition of the roads and Adams' reluctance to travel on the Sabbath. To Abigail Adams, who had never been out of Massachusetts, the province of Pennsylvania was that far country, unimaginably distant, and their separations lasting months at a time had become extremely difficult for her. "Winter makes its approaches fast," she had written to John in November. "I hope I shall not be obliged to spend it without my dearest friend. I have been like a nun in a cloister ever since you went away." He would never return to Philadelphia without her, he had vowed in a letter from his lodgings there. But they each knew better, just as each understood the importance of having Joseph Bass go with him. The young man was a tie with home, a familiar home face. Once Adams had resettled in Philadelphia, Bass would return home with the horses, and bring also whatever could be found of the common small necessities impossible to obtain now, with war at the doorstep. Could Bass bring her a bundle of pins, Abigail had requested earlier in the bloody spring of 1775? She was entirely understanding of John's arduous task. Her determination that he play his part was quite as strong as his own. They were of one and the same spirit. "You cannot be, I know, nor do I wish to see you an inactive spectator," she wrote at her kitchen table. "We have too many high-sounding words, and too few actions that correspond with them." Unlike the delegates of Philadelphia, she and the children were confronted with the reality of war every waking hour. For though British troops were bottled up in Boston, the British fleet commanded the harbor and the sea, and thus no town by the shore was safe from attack. Those Braintree families who were able to leave had already packed and moved inland, out of harm's way. Meanwhile, shortages of sugar, coffee, pepper, shoes, and ordinary pins were worse than he had any idea. "The cry for pins is so great that what we used to buy for 7 shillings and 6pence are now 20 shillings, and not to be had for that. A bundle of pins contained 6,000, she explained. These she could sell for hard money, or use for barter." There had been a rush of excitement when the British sent an expedition to seize hay and livestock on one of the islands offshore. The alarm flew like lightning, Abigail reported. Men from all parts came flocking down till 2,000 were collected. The crisis had passed, but not her state of nerves, with the house so close to the road and the comings and goings of soldiers. They stopped at her door for food and slept on her kitchen floor. Pewter spoons were melted for bullets in her fireplace. "Sometimes refugees from Boston, tired and fatigued, seek an asylum for a day or night, a week," she wrote to John. "You can hardly imagine how we live." "Pray, don't let Bass forget my pins," she reminded him again. "I endeavor to live in the most frugal manner possible, but I am many times distressed." The day of the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775, the thunder of the bombardment had been terrifying, even at the distance of Braintree. Earlier in April, when news came of Lexington and Concord, John, who was at home at the time, had saddled his horse and gone to see for himself, riding for miles along the route of the British march, past burned-out houses and scenes of extreme distress. He knew then what war meant, what the British meant, and warned Abigail that in case of danger she and the children must fly to the woods. But she was as intent to see for herself as he, and with the bombardment at Bunker Hill ringing in her ears, she had taken 7-year-old Johnny by the hand and hurried up the road to the top of nearby Penn's Hill. From a granite outcropping that breached the summit like the hump of a whale, she could see the smoke of battle rising beyond Boston, 10 miles up the bay. It was the first all-out battle of the war. "How many have fallen we know not," she wrote that night. "The constant roar of the cannon is so distressing that we cannot eat, drink, or sleep." Their friend Joseph Warren had been killed at Bunker Hill, Abigail reported in another letter. A handsome young physician and leading patriot allied with Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, Warren had been one of the worthiest men of the province. John had known him since the smallpox epidemic of 1764, when John had gone to Boston to be inoculated. Now Joseph Warren was dead, at age 34, shot through the face, his body horribly mutilated by British bayonets. My bursting heart must find vent at my pen, Abigail told her absent husband. At Cambridge, the morning of the bitterly cold first day of the new year, 1776, George Washington had raised the new Continental flag with 13 stripes before his headquarters and announced that the new army was now entirely continental. But for days afterward, their enlistments up, hundreds, thousands of troops, New England militia, started for home. Replacements had to be found. An immensely difficult and potentially perilous changing of the guard had to be carried off. One army moving out, another moving in, all in the bitter winds and snow of winter in such fashion as the enemy would never know. It is not in the pages of history, perhaps, to furnish a case like ours, Washington informed John Hancock, president of the Continental Congress. Hardly 5,000 colonial troops were fit for duty. Promises of men, muskets, powder, and urgently needed supplies never materialized. Blankets and linen for bandages were greatly wanted. Firewood was in short supply. With smallpox spreading in Boston, the British command had allowed pathetic columns of the ill-clad, starving poor of Boston to come pouring out of town and into the American lines, many of them sick, and all in desperate need of food and shelter. The reflection on my situation, and that of this army, produces many an unhappy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep, wrote Washington, who had never before commanded anything larger than a regiment. The night of January 8th, Washington had ordered a brief American assault on Charlestown, largely to keep the British guessing. Adams, at home at his desk writing a letter, was brought to his feet by the sudden crash of the guns, a very hot fire of artillery that lasted half an hour and lit the sky over Braintree's North Common. Whether American forces were on the attack or defense he could not tell, but in either case I rejoice, he wrote, taking up his pen again, for defeat appears to me preferable to total inaction. As it was, Washington saw his situation to be so precarious that the only choice was an all-out attack on Boston, and he wrote to tell Adams, "I am exceedingly desirous of consulting you." As a former delegate to Philadelphia, Washington understood the need to keep Congress informed. Earlier, concerned whether his authority reached beyond Boston to the defense of New York, he had asked Adams for an opinion, and Adams' reply had been characteristically unhesitating and unambiguous. "Your commission constitutes you commander of all the forces, and you are vested with full power and authority to act as you shall think for the good and welfare of the service." No one in Congress had impressed Adams more. On the day he had called on his fellow delegates to put their colleague, the gentleman from Virginia, in command at Boston, Washington, out of modesty, had left the chamber, while a look of mortification, as Adams would tell the story, filled the face of John Hancock, who had hoped he would be chosen. Washington was virtuous, brave, and in his new responsibilities, one of the most important characters in the world, Adams had informed Abigail. The liberties of America depend upon him in great degree. Later, when she met Washington at a Cambridge reception, Abigail thought John had not said half enough in praise of him. A council of war with the commander and his generals convened January 16th in the parlor of the large house on Brattle Street, Cambridge, that served as Washington's headquarters. With others of the Massachusetts congressional delegation still at Philadelphia, Adams was the only member of Congress present as Washington made the case for an attack on Boston by sending his troops across the frozen bay. But the generals flatly rejected the plan, and it was put aside. 2 days later, Adams was summoned again. Devastating news had arrived by dispatch rider. An American assault on Quebec, led by Colonels Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, had failed. The gallant Montgomery was dead. Brave Arnold was wounded. It was a crushing moment for Washington and for John Adams. Congress had ordered the invasion of Canada. The plan was Washington's own, and the troops were mostly New Englanders. As a young man, struggling over what to make of his life, Adams had often pictured himself as a soldier. Only the previous spring, when Washington had appeared in Congress resplendent in the blue and buff uniform of a Virginia militia officer, Adams had written to Abigail, "Oh, that I was a soldier." He was reading military books. "Everybody must and will be a soldier," he told her.